Okay, so picture this. You've just spent years absolutely agonizing over the security of your home. You've built this massive, impenetrable wall all around your city just to keep out external threats. The gates are shut tight, the guards are at their posts, and you finally breathe this huge sigh of relief, right? You're thinking, we are completely secure. But what happens when the physical walls of a city are perfectly intact, yet the very enemy you are trying to keep out is already living comfortably inside the most sacred room of your temple? It's a stunning paradox, really, where physical security completely fails to guarantee your internal spiritual safety. Welcome to today's Explainer. We are digging into a totally fascinating ancient text today, the 13th chapter of Nehemiah. And I absolutely love dissecting historical narratives like this, because honestly, they aren't just dry, dusty records of the past. They're literal masterclasses in human behavior. Today, we're using this text as a really powerful case study in crisis management, setting boundaries, and just decisive leadership. We're going to look at exactly how an ancient leader navigated a total institutional breakdown, and we'll extract some incredibly practical, timeless principles that apply just as much to us today as they did thousands of years ago. All right, let's dive right into our roadmap for today. We'll be looking at building the invisible wall, compromise in the temple, cleansing the sacred space, restoring the system, and finally, the 10-second prayer. So, part 1, building the invisible wall.
Let's set the scene here. The Israelites have just finished rebuilding the physical walls of Jerusalem. They're all gathered together, reading aloud from the Book of Moses, and they come to this stark realization about their boundaries. There's this profound contrast between what we can see and what we can't. Physical walls are practical, right? If you close the gates at night, physical threats, enemy armies, or unregulated merchants simply cannot get in. But spiritual or internal walls? Those are vastly more difficult to construct. As the ancient proverb says, a person without control over their own spirit is like a city with broken down walls. So the Israelites realized that while their stone walls were finally up, their internal spiritual boundaries, which are built by listening to and obeying the word of God, well, those were the true foundation of their community's safety.
Now, as they read through the text, they find this really explicit command to separate themselves from the Ammonites and the Moabites. But listen, the crucial point here is this. We cannot view this merely through a modern lens of ethnic exclusion. As our sources point out, this was fundamentally about an attitude. Historically, these specific groups didn't just passively disagree with Israel. They actively hostile. They actually went as far as hiring prophets like Balaam to curse them and sought their total destruction. The separation was all about protecting the community from active spiritual hostility. And to prove this point, you just have to look elsewhere in the ancient text. Take Ruth, for example. She was a Moabite, but because she had a posture of faith and alignment with God, she was completely welcomed in. She actually became an ancestor of Jesus. So the boundary drawn here was entirely about protecting the inner life of the community from toxic, hostile influences. Which brings us to part 2, compromise in the temple. Almost immediately, these brand new boundaries are breached right from the inside. And you really have to consider the sheer irony here. The high priest, a man named Eliashib, literally the guy entrusted with guarding the spiritual life of the city, invites a man named Tobiah to move into the temple. He actually clears out a massive sacred storage room in the house of God and sets up a VIP apartment for him. And who is this Tobiah guy? He's an Ammonite leader. In fact, if you read earlier in the text, Tobiah was one of the main antagonists who actively mocked the Israelites while they were trying to build the wall. He literally joked that a fox walking on it would knock it down. Which obviously begs the question, why on earth would a high priest compromise with someone who had literally mocked the sacred work of his own people? Well, the source analysis suggests it really just comes down to worldly leverage. Tobias was super well connected. He had formed alliances with a lot of the nobles in Judah. He was a man of wealth, influence, and earthly power. Eliashib likely compromised because he stopped relying entirely on God and just started relying on the political and financial convenience that Tobias brought to the table. He traded sacred, dedicated space for a comfortable worldly alliance. Moving on to part 3, cleansing the sacred space. Now, while all of this internal corruption is going down, Nehemiah had actually been away visiting the king of Babylon, but when he finally returns to Jerusalem and discovers this evil, that the sacred courts of God have literally been turned into a studio apartment for a hostile influencer, his reaction is incredibly swift and dynamic. The text says, "And I was very angry, and I threw all the household furniture of Tobiah out of the chamber." I absolutely love the raw energy of this verse.
Nehemiah doesn't form an exploratory committee. He doesn't hold a 6-week consultation to discuss the nuances of Tobiah's lease agreement. No way. He exhibits righteous anger and takes immediate, decisive action. He personally throws the guy's furniture right out into the street and orders the rooms to be spiritually cleansed and restored to their proper use. Our sources actually compare this to that famous moment when Jesus flips the tables in the temple. It's just a total zero-tolerance policy for compromise in sacred spaces.
And that leads us to part 4, restoring the system. Now, throwing out the furniture, sure, that makes for an awesome, dramatic moment. But true leadership is about systematically rebuilding what is right. When Nehemiah looks past the pile of furniture in the courtyard, he identifies a massive systemic collapse. You see, by renting out that treasury room to Tobiah, the temple had no place left to store the tithes, the grain, the new wine, the oil. And because there were no tithes being stored, the Levites and the singers, the people who actually did the daily operational work of the temple, weren't getting fed. Because they weren't getting fed, they had literally abandoned their sacred posts and fled to their own fields just to farm and survive. The compromise at the top had completely starved out the workers at the bottom. So what does Nehemiah do? He executes this masterful 4-step restoration. First, he confronts the officials head-on, demanding, why is the house of God forsaken? He holds the leadership accountable. Second, acting in pure faith, he recalls the Levites to their posts before the money even arrives. Third, seeing this faithful leadership, all of Judah responds and brings their tithes back into the storehouses. And fourth, to ensure this never ever happens again, he appoints a highly organized, reliable team of treasurers. And this brilliantly illustrates how spiritual zeal absolutely must be paired with practical wisdom and faithful stewardship. Nehemiah is just incredibly smart here. He doesn't just hand the keys back to Eliashib, right? He builds this fantastic, diverse team to oversee things. He appoints Shelemiah, who brings the perspective of a priest, Zadok, who has the meticulous, detail-oriented nature of a scribe, Pedaiah, representing the working Levites, and Hanan, acting as an assistant or layperson. He effectively decentralizes the power by bringing all these different backgrounds to the table to manage the finances honestly. But here's the real kicker. Despite their diverse resumes, there was one non-negotiable prerequisite for this job. The text notes they were appointed because they were considered reliable, and their duty was to distribute fairly to their brothers. Nehemiah wasn't just looking for financial acumen or someone who was really good with spreadsheets. He looked for deeply ingrained spiritual character. Faithfulness and reliability were the ultimate qualifications, because a corrupt system can only be permanently fixed by men of unshakable integrity. Finally, part 5, the 10-second prayer. After all this intense, grand-scale administration, confronting priests, throwing out furniture, overhauling the entire national treasury, the narrative suddenly shifts. The volume just completely drops. We move from the loud, public square into this really quiet, deeply introspective moment with the leader himself. Right after setting up the treasures, Nehemiah prays this incredibly brief, 10-second internal prayer. He says, "Remember me, O my God, concerning this, and do not wipe out my good deeds that I have done for the house of my God and for his service." It is such a profound window into the soul of this guy. He has just accomplished something massive, yet he doesn't call a press conference. He operates entirely for an audience of one. Our sources break down the absolute beauty of this prayer so perfectly. Nehemiah's core motivations are just laid bare here. First, he's seeking God's remembrance, completely bypassing the need for human applause or validation. Second, he's acting like a true, faithful servant who, right upon completing a task, immediately reports back to his master to hand over the results. And third, by asking God not to wipe out his deeds, he recognizes something crucial. For his administrative work to have any lasting, eternal spiritual impact, God has to bless it and sustain it. He knows he can fix the treasury, but only God can change the hearts of the people over the long haul. So I want to leave this right in your lap. When you pour your energy into something, when you finish your work, when you set a hard boundary, or when you do the right thing even when it is wildly unpopular, whose approval are you seeking? Are you looking around to see who noticed? Or are you, like Nehemiah, able to quietly hand that work up to an audience of one, trusting that the only validation that truly matters is from God? It's a pretty powerful thought to carry with you as you inspect the walls of your own life. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep learning, keep building those boundaries, and I'll catch you next time.